Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are. I'm Malcolm Woolf, President and CEO of the National Hydropower Association, and I'd like to welcome you to the latest installment of our Path to Clean Energy webinar virtual series. As the title suggests, NHA believes that the path to decarbonizing our electric grid runs through hydropower and pump storage. Obviously, water power alone isn't going to get us there. Wind, solar, energy storage, nuclear, and others, all working in tandem, is how we achieve that goal. And our virtual series is designed to be a platform to explore all things clean energy from a 360-degree perspective. Today's event is titled, What the 2020 Elections Mean for Clean Energy, and we're thrilled to partner with ClearPath to bring you a lively discussion of how the election could shape the future of our ever-evolving electricity system. To that end, we've assembled what I describe as an all-star panel of energy professionals, all of whom have and continue to leave an indelible mark on energy policy, legislation, and regulation. And given that we only have an hour of time this afternoon, let me quickly introduce them. I'm going to start with Jim Connaughton. Jim is the former White House chairman of the Council on Environmental Quality under President George W. Bush. And today he serves as president and CEO of Nautilus Data Technologies. Welcome, Jim. Karen Wayland is a recognized expert in national energy and environmental policy, serving as senior advisor to Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi and in the Obama Department of Energy. Today she serves as founder of KW Energy Strategies. Hey, Karen.
Hi.
And last but not least is Rich Powell. Rich is the executive director of ClearPath, an organization developing and advancing conservative policies that accelerate clean energy innovation. Rich has served as a member of the advisory committee to the Export-Import Bank of the United States and the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Centers Advisory Group. You'll notice that Rich is conspicuously absent on the screen. He's wrapping up a panel with the Milken Institute and will be joining our conversation in just a moment. Also, Katherine Hamilton has been pulled away and unable to join us today. I am looking forward to this conversation on what the election means for clean energy, but I want it to be more than a conversation among the folks on the screen. So there is a comment chat feature. So if you have questions, please put them in the comment section, and we will try to work in as many of your questions as we can. So with that, let me get started. And the first topic that I want to raise is infrastructure and economic stimulus. Regardless of who wins the election, the next president will be confronted with calls for an economic stimulus package. And the package could be narrow, or it could include major infrastructure and/or tax provisions. So let me start with you, Jim. How do you think the election impacts the prospects for major new federal investment in clean energy, or extension of the expiring clean energy tax credits over the next year?
So I think the thing to focus on, regardless of who wins the presidency and regardless of what the congressional makeup is, there's going to be a focus on COVID and a focus on stimulus. Okay, and the question is in what order and at the same time. And when it comes to stimulus, there's no question the stimulus focus will be broad. So where does clean energy fit in a broader infrastructure and stimulus package? If you think of the people hardest hit, with COVID, they're not people in the clean energy space. So when you think of the politics of the response, we have to work our way backwards from getting as many people back to work as possible in as many settings as possible. That said, infrastructure is a great place to create a lot of new jobs, and manufacturing is a great place to create a lot of new jobs that are COVID protected. So I'm in the essential infrastructure business myself, and we're doing well. We're keeping everyone safe, but we're giving people great work in clean energy and clean data, actually. So there's a real opportunity there. The other point I will make is our opportunity for enormity of success comes from bipartisanship and an inclusive infrastructure approach. So Clean Energy Plus An inclusive infrastructure approach gets you everybody, number one. And then the mistake not to make this time that's been made in the past is we need everyone to agree that levering it is a good idea. And certainly I know Karen has experience with the different kinds of programs for her time in government. And we've all made the mistake, which is actually listen to what Donald Trump has said. He's sometimes right. And on this one, leveraging public dollars with private investment could be ginormous. Okay, you're talking about taking the public dollar and extending it by another $8 or $9 of jobs, of good family wage jobs, building out clean new infrastructure. So if we can all keep our heads on that the private sector, public sector is good, an inclusive infrastructure policy is good, we're going to have jobs as far as the eye can see in a more modern economy.
Now, I know I'll take issue a little bit with your comment, Jim, because I know hundreds of thousands of folks in the clean energy space has lost their jobs as a result of COVID. So the clean energy sector, probably hydro is probably even more insulated than most, but many in the clean energy sector have been affected. But obviously, it's a huge economy, and COVID has been disruptive to in lots of sectors, and clean energy isn't the forefront. Karen, what's your take?
We can now bring them back because in the essential infrastructure where I operate, we now have a really good empirical track record of doing it COVID safely.
Right. And I think that's true in the solar sector and a lot of other sectors.
Yeah.
Karen, what's your take? Do you think there's going to be a major infrastructure bill?
Yeah, I agree with Jim. I will say that I've been doing a lot of work thinking about what would be in a kind of recovery style, not the rescue bills that Congress is doing, up till now with unemployment insurance and healthcare and aid to, the states. But what does the next piece look like, the recovery and creating those jobs? And key to that is getting money out the door quickly. And I absolutely agree with you, Jim, that you've got to have those. You'll get the best weight if you can leverage the public dollars with private dollars. And one of the fastest ways that you can do that is go through existing programs. So we don't want to go through what we had to do in the Recovery Act, which was, set up a whole new set of rules for new programs, which took time. And so when you think about utility investment, which I know, Jim, you know well, what you're going to want, and this big talk about what in the Recovery Act was what's shovel ready. And so a lot of that is going to have to be pre-approved by, projects that are already in the works that have been approved by Public Utility Commission or on the verge of being approved. And those are, there are a lot of projects out there. And, in the utility sector where I'm doing a lot of work and thinking through the grid modernization, they are not looking for 100%. They are looking for federal cost share, not 100%, which gets you to the idea that you don't want to displace private capital, you actually want to leverage it. So I agree. I think that even if we somehow cannot get a stimulus package through, there are must-pass bills like the transportation bill that will have massive infusions of federal money into the construction and infrastructure space. So I think that we're going to be building things in 2021.
We, along with others in the clean energy space, are pushing for an extension of the tax credits that expire at the end of this year. Even if there's not a major stimulus package, any guesses on whether a short-term extension of the clean energy tax credits is in the cards?
You mean this year or next year?
I would say first kind of in a lame duck, and then what your prospect is for next year.
Boy, Congress has let those expire and then come back and pick them up again in the following year. I mean, the idea that there's any sort of certainty in those tax credits is out the door. So my crystal ball is that I think they'll get extended. I just don't know what's going to happen. What Congress is. Who knows what's going to happen around November 3rd? We're in such a state of uncertainty that I think for sure that they will get extended. And I think that you're pretty close to getting some agreement on some of the additional provisions that were left out of the previous extensions, as well as potentially to get the storage incentive in there. I think those compromises are well underway. I just can't tell you whether it's going to happen in a lame duck or in 2021.
Jim, what's your sense? And actually for, there's the existing tax credits And then for a while now, folks have been talking about a new credit for energy storage. Any thoughts on either of those?
Yeah, I think Karen has pegged it, which is it's anybody's guess, okay, because it's always been so variable. My personal view is whatever it is, and it always ends up in this messy package, whatever it is, I actually want it to be short term because I don't want to create a moral hazard against the big deal that we'll talk about in a minute, because we could end up putting a lot of political capital into these tax credits, which are of marginal value at this point, in my view, when the big game is finally in front of us again. And I don't want to take away the pressure, the positive pressure toward doing something really big and really inclusive if we start chipping away at political pieces that are necessary to that puzzle. So I would encourage everybody who's self-interested, and everybody is, to understand that we're in a cycle of immense value to everybody. So don't blow it with political capital on marginal benefits.
Yeah,
that's interesting point. So let's turn to the more ambitious ideas and topics on the table. Vice President Biden has identified climate change as one of 4 major crises confronting the nation, along with COVID, economic recovery, and racial justice. And he has included as part of his climate proposal 100% clean energy standard as one of the centerpieces. I noted that almost all investor-owned utilities have already adopted their own decarbonization plans. So, Karen, let me turn over to you. What's your take on a clean energy standard? Is something like that now realistic in the next Congress?
I think it's realistic. I think it's not going to happen in the first 100 days. I think that's a pretty that would be a pretty aggressive process for a new idea that hasn't seen a lot of legislative history in the U.S. Congress. But I think that some of the deals that have been made at the state level and the bills that have come out and been introduced that include nuclear, that include biomass, that include waste to energy, that those are a really good starting point. And it looks different and it feels different than the RPS battles that we were having, 10, 15 years ago in the national debate. So I'm optimistic because I think that the prices are going to keep coming down on renewables. I mean, incrementally, we're not going to see the same kind of really sharp declines, but they're going to keep coming down. Storage is going to keep becoming more economical, and I think there is a growing recognition in the environmental community that nuclear, at least existing nuclear, has to continue to be in the mix, which a clean energy standard would do far better, I think, than some of these state policies, zero energy policies that have been aimed at keeping those nuclear power plants open. So I will say that I think that there are some pretty big battles that will be refought, even though they were fought and fixed in California, over definitions of what gets included. And I think that's not just between whether you put nuclear in or not. Malcolm, you're going to have to be fighting over whether big existing hydro is included. And the issues over biomass and waste energy are things that I think there are a number of environmental groups that are still going to want to fight over. So that's why I don't think it's going to happen quickly in the first half of next year, because there's going to have to be a lot of legislative wrangling. But it does feel different to me now because so much of the sector is already pushing that way and has made long-term investments to get to this fifth place.
Now, that's a great point, Karen, and I think you're right in highlighting that clean energy standards are different from renewable portfolio standards. And I worked on RPS laws on Capitol Hill and in the state government, and they really were intended 20 years ago to incentivize new development of wind and solar and to get them to grid parity. Well, now we're there, and the goalposts are changing. We don't just want a 20% renewable, we want a clean energy grid. And so certainly NHA's perspective is that if we're going to have a clean energy grid, you have to include all forms of zero carbon technologies, whether new or existing. And so that obviously would include the existing technologies. Jim, let me pull you into this conversation. Do you think a clean energy standard is on the horizon?
Yes. It's not only on the horizon, it's essential. It's important. But I want to sort of build on both of your comments, which is the negotiation is to get to simplicity. which will be hard, and simplicity, it should be about emissions. A clean energy standard should be about clean energy. Okay, and so the challenge will be for all of us. Let the states do whatever they want locally, but the challenge for us at the federal level is to be about emissions. And by the way, not about zero emission technology. It should be about emissions. Okay, and so that way we can have the most technologically inclusive piece of legislation. We can have the most politically inclusive piece of legislation. And we can have the most geographically relevant piece of legislation to allow all sources to compete for their share of emissions reduction to hit the goal. If we do that, you can then beat back all the naysayers, whether it's on cronyism, crony clean energy capitalism, or whether the naysayers on runaway costs, or the naysayers on competition with China and others. You can beat that back if you focus on emissions reduction. Now, one other comment. I love the fact that we now have a clear bid ask. So the Biden campaign has said for power, it said net zero by 2035. You have almost the entire investor-owned utility community saying 80 to 100 by 2050. Okay. So I've done this before, many times actually. When you've got a bid ask like that, go for the most inclusive target you can go for and bank it. And so, by the way, I would be perfectly fine with 80% by 2050 as a national standard. Okay, as long as there's a good, clear ramp down, I'd be perfectly happy with that if that gets me 85 votes in the Senate. Okay, so I can go for 100. By the way, I think 100 is technologically possible. I think 100 is economically possible. We'll get to it in a minute. I don't think 100 is procedurally possible. We'll have to get to that in a minute. Right. Don't let the very, very, very good be the enemy, right?
And I think that's a great point. That there's a way to, so Nevada passed a very aggressive renewable portfolio standard. It doesn't commit to 100% by 2050, but the language is there to put them on the ramp towards that. And I think that, if you're going to have aggressive targets like that, 100% by 2050, there's a whole set of investments in innovation that we're going to need to have along the way to get us the technologies to get us to 100%. And I don't know if they'll happen together, but I think, if you think about, I remember working with the speaker, we were working on Waxman Markey, and she was saying, this would not be the last time that Congress would ever visit a bill if we passed it now. So you think about an aggressive CES that can get 85 votes. I'd love to see that. You guarantee that before 2050, Congress would be revisiting that again.
Yeah, and I would add, we know from experience that 80 gets you 100.
Yeah.
And so, and by the way, if we can knock off 80 and we feel really confident we're on our way there, then to ratchet the remaining 20 is so much easier. The acid rain trading program is a great example. It started at 50, which people thought was impossible. We got there faster and cheaper than we thought, and it made getting the next 80 that much easier through we wish we had legislation, ended up doing it through regulation, but we still got there. In this instance, legislation is important. And let me make a key thing. One of my pieces of advocacy over the next 24 months is going to be pick your number. Because so much of clean energy debate to date has been a proxy war over the disagreement over how far, how fast. Okay? And perhaps the most important thing that Congress can do is settle on a number. Because when Congress settles on a number, it's amazing how much all the other deals work.
A number and a date, right?
A number and a date. Mm-hmm. And that's what I'm saying. Why be greedy? I don't need to be greedy. 80% by 2050 is Paris, by the way. And 80% by 2050 is where the Business Roundtable is. Okay, that's half the employers in America, half the energy users in America. And it's where almost all the utilities are. So when you've got all those interests lined up to say, please, we will give you your target and we'll give you your date, the Congress should just say yes, right? And then let's let the rest of the policy hang off of that.
So let me build on that last comment. Congress, regardless of who wins the election, neither party is expected to have 60 votes in the Senate. So is broader action on an economy-wide climate bill possible, or are we likely to be kind of limited in the conversation on what can get 60 votes, if anything? Who wants to tackle that one?
Let me start, just because this is the most important question you've asked, which is the only way to get durable legislation is for it to be bipartisan. Okay, so I hope, I hope either, if the Senate flips, but I hope the filibuster stays, because with the filibuster you'll get a durable deal. Okay, without the filibuster, we're going to end up in the polar extremes of each camp dominating the legislative debate in the Senate, and we're going to end up with we didn't get Waxman-Markey, and we didn't get the clean energy standard a year later that the president wisely proposed. Obama proposed a year later, and that's because when you get rid of the filibuster and you're back into 50-50 politics in the Senate, the extremes dominate the discussion. So I am a big fan of institutionalism in this setting, and we know it from prior experience that the most important deals have been cut in the Senate. Think of the 2007 energy bill as one of the best examples, when everyone's working together and it's inclusive. So there's a procedural piece and a substantive piece here. I also would say, could we please learn from the past, okay? And as much as it's attractive to do, quote, economy-wide, nothing economy-wide ever passes the Congress. It never has, and it never will, ever. So why do we have this fantasy about that? Treat the power sector like you want, treat transportation like you want, treat the other sectors each alone, agriculture and industry, and watch how quickly they then demand for more integration of policy. But you won't get that to begin with, and so don't do it.
Yeah, I don't think it's on the table anymore. I honestly, I have been talking about sector by sector approaches for a long time, and I just don't see. I think there is, some move to put a carbon tax on the table, but I just don't think that's a serious. I think there's serious people behind it, and I think there's a lot of analytical work behind it, but I don't see the vote there. I don't see, in the first 2 years of the Biden administration, I just don't see anybody wasting capital on that when there are a lot of funds on the table that you can get off, out of the atmosphere quickly.
So an economy-wide bill makes getting to 60 votes harder, not easier. Rich, thrilled you're able to join us. Thank you and ClearPath for partnering with us on this event. Let me pull you into that conversation. If Congress can't get anything done, if because of the filibuster, because of divided government, a climate bill or a clean energy standard isn't possible, do you think, let's say Biden were to win the White House, would doing something on climate via regulation, like the Clean Power Plan, is that a scenario that we need to worry about?
I think it'd be really a not ideal scenario. I mean, clearly the Clean Power Plan and the last attempt to use the existing Clean Air Act authorities to regulate, CO2 from point sources and power plants ran into significant trouble. We don't know exactly how the Supreme Court were ruled on that, but we did see that stay, and that was under a Supreme Court that was, probably even more permissive of that kind of thing than we'll see next year. That's not to say that I can't imagine a Biden administration trying to sort of go back to that structure and that policy. And I think they probably saw from the experience with the MATS rules that, even if something eventually gets struck down, there's actually quite a bit of power in putting the regulation out in the first place, even if you're not sure that it's going to be upheld. That's clearly not the way to build bipartisan consensus around this issue in the long run, right? I think that's a way to push us back to our respective corners. And, I'll pile on with what Jim said there, which is, the key here is finding what is the way that works. What is that deal that would get you 60? Or I tend to think it's going to have to be actually significantly more than 60 votes. I'm not sure that there's a deal that gets you 60. I think there might be a deal that gets you 80, and that sort of cuts off people on, on the far ends on either side, but that 80 folks in the middle could agree with. And I don't think that that's going to be started with a regulatory kind of top-down administrative approach. I also just don't see that approach and the structure of the existing kind of Clean Air Act and point source pollution regulation, all that, CO2 is just a really different kind of a problem, and we're going to want a lot more flexibility in our power sector about how to deal with that problem than just treating this as a point by point pollution type issue. It's just very different.
So let me remind folks, if you've got questions, please feel free to put it in the comments feature, and we'll try to incorporate them. But I didn't mean to cut you off, Jim. Go ahead.
No, President Bush made very clear in 2008 that the only way to really do this right is through legislation. And then in less than 6 months, Barack Obama said the same thing. And in the Bush years, it took us 6 years to get to the Clean Air Interstate Rule through regulation. And then it got redone under Obama, and then it got litigated. So it was 15 years later before it could be investable. And then the same was true, it took the Obama administration 7 years to produce the Clean Power Plan. Okay, and during that period, nobody could really invest against it. And then in the litigation that followed, nobody could invest against it. So we lost 15 years of cumulative emissions reduction with, again, the perfect trying to be the enemy of being the enemy of the very good. So we shouldn't let Congress off the hook this time. We should all collectively insisting, pick your number, pick your date, and let the policy follow.
So I think that's right.
Karen, please.
Well, I think that's right, and I think that the right place to do the power plant rule, the power plant emissions, is in Congress. I'm not sure that that's the case for transportation. So I think that we could put back on the table the kinds of deals for fuel efficiency standards that were in the works under the Obama administration, and that gets you a long way to dealing with, and some dealing with batteries, dealing with maybe hydrogen, that you can look at the transportation sector very differently and not necessarily need the hammer coming from Congress. There can be more kind of carrots coming from Congress and that fuel efficiency standard as a way to really make progress in the transportation sector.
That's an interesting point. I was going to pick on or pull out something, Rich, that you said and that I think, Jim, you were alluding to, which is clean energy standards getting to 60 votes and whether they should be technology driven or technology agnostic. If I heard you right, Jim, by suggesting that they should be emission based, not technology based, you're suggesting that you don't limit it to zero carbon technologies, but you would let other technologies such as natural gas participate. Am I hearing you right? And you just kind of structure it based on carbon intensity or something? What's your thought on that? You're
hearing me right. I mean, the simplest legislation would be to add carbon to Title IV of the Clean Air Act and just put a date down. Okay, so that's and EPA already knows how to implement that. So by the way, that would be a 4-page bill. Okay, but it should be emissions based. Okay, and here's why: we will end up in endless debates over what the actual carbon number is for solar, for wind, for nuclear, for carbon capture and storage, for gas plus methane. You'll be in this endless do loop over what's zero, and the zero will be fake. Okay, and both sides will be able to complain about it. We are really good in America when we have an emission standard. Okay, we do it powerfully. And by the way, after you overcome the political battles, it's effortless, right? The entire investment and technology sector just aims for the best outcomes. And so why would we deprive ourselves of that seamlessness of innovation over these arcane equations around what zero is? There will never be a definition of zero that everyone can agree on.
That's really interesting, and certainly the hydro industry is facing that challenge now. We're emissions free, but over the life cycle, every technology has some emissions.
And so the climate doesn't care. The climate just cares about the emission. The cumulative CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions. Not that the climate cares about. So let's have the policy focus on that.
Interesting. All right, we've got our first question here that I want to pull up if I can. There we go. Not sure if this is you could put that on the screen, Kelly, or not. But NHA today made a joint statement with a number of environmental groups and river conservation groups, which is really reflecting our shared desire to deal with the urgent challenge of climate change. So the question is, How does that recent announcement get manifested into national policy? And do you think that's going to change any of the conversations with respect to hydropower? I wasn't going to ask the question, but since it came from the audience, there you go. Who wants to tackle that first?
Can I say three things? First, Kurt has the best profile picture I've maybe ever seen on one of these things, so that's great. Second, I just want to say an enormous congratulations, Malcolm, to you and to NHA. I mean, I think this has been a kind of a decade-long conversation and effort trying to bring together the conservation community and the clean hydropower community on finding common ground about climate and whether there are ways that both can win, where we can decrease the local environmental impacts of hydropower, but also increase the generation of clean emission-free hydropower. And I just think that that's such a terrific win-win. So congratulations to NHA for pulling that together very fortuitously today as we do this. And third, I mean, I think that needs to be represented in federal policy, particularly on the regulation side. So much of the problem in hydropower is not really about proactively promoting it with standards or mandates or incentives or anything. It's just about kind of getting the regulatory morass out of the way of holding it back, right? In so many cases, hydropower is already a completely economic source of power on the cost side because it's flexible energy. It's often higher revenue electricity than many other sources of clean electricity. It can function as storage or as a just kind of primary generating power. So I mean, hydro has just got so much going for it. It's really the regulation and these kind of endless, in some cases, decades-long timelines holding it back, whether that's relicensing an existing facility or upgrading an existing facility or getting something new online. And so I think it's really going to be about the regulatory fixes that need to be made to ensure that we can maintain what we've got. And I think kind of a third of it is at risk of going down if it's not relicensed. Malcolm, this is your whole job, so you could I just dip my toe in hydro from time to time. But I think we need to get that relicensing process back on track so that even relatively small facilities are willing to make the investment in relicensing to keep that up and running. I mean, that's a lot of clean power. I mean, a third of the national hydro fleet potentially going down due to, relicensing costs and timelines in the next decade. That would be a huge hit to clean, flexible power production, and very difficult for us to kind of dig our way back from with just kind of adding other, variable renewables plus storage, which is what you'd have to do to get that, that flexible power right now. So I think this is a huge win. I think it opens up a whole new angle on federal regulatory policy.
Yeah, and I think this compromise goes beyond hydropower in terms of setting up the way that a dialogue has to happen between those on one side and the other of the siting discussion. And because it's not just about building new, it's about the regulatory regime around increasing the efficiency of our existing infrastructure. So it could take a decade to get the licensing to actually make a hydro dam more efficient, given the same or better environmental outcome. And we're losing all those benefits because the permitting process is so lengthy and so, in many cases, very contentious. The same is true with transmission. We know we need more transmission if we want to meet our, very aggressive climate goals. And the Biden campaign has talked about rewiring existing transmission, actually making existing transmission lines more efficient. Well, in many cases, that's going to involve the same kind of NEPA approval process as building new transmission. And if we have trouble just doing the upgrades to our existing transmission because of siting and environmental concerns, that's going to have a whole lot of issues around the ability for us to do new infrastructure. So I think that this is, I want to congratulate you, Malcolm, for spearheading this discussion, because the idea, the work around setting and permitting, we're going to need a lot more of it in the next couple of years. We're going to need a lot of compromises around, predetermined feelings about bedrock environmental laws, I think, in order to get us the clean power that we want.
Can I weigh in real quick on the partnership point? I'm a musical theater fan, and one of my favorite musicals is Oklahoma. And there's this great song where the grandmarm of the whole group sings, "Oh, the farmers and the cowhands must be friends." And that's what this clean energy discussion has to be. And what you've done is a key first step And I've got an expression I would just want to share with you, which is so much of the clean energy discussion to date has been about particular technologies, being against other technologies. Okay, and then this concept emerged, stop being against that which you're not specifically for. Okay, so but there's a more important expression for us to get to 80 votes in the Senate, okay, in the next cycle, and it's start being for that which you were specifically against. So if the hydro people can be for nuclear, if the nuclear people can be for renewables, if everybody can be for carbon capture on gas and on coal, now we have an inclusive political foundation on which to get to 100% net zero. Okay, but everybody has to be for everybody else to get to that political conclusion. Okay, and that's what this partnership is about. It's about building all the blocks of everybody supporting ourselves to net zero, rather than trying to siphon off our own self-interest in that equation.
Really interesting perspectives, and thank you for the kind words about today's announcement. I'd be remiss if I didn't give credit where credit is due. Dan Riker led this effort, facilitated the conversation, conceived this idea years before I got to NHA. So he's certainly the laboring oar in trying to bring this dialogue together. Stanford's Uncommon Dialogue process does this with other areas and other unusual dialogues as well. And it's really helped us build a much greater understanding with my counterparts in other organizations. So Bob Irvin at American Rivers and Dave Steindorf at American Hydropower Reform Coalition and others. It's been a long process to change our mindset, to realize, as you said, Jim, that we can be for things that we're not against, and that is a different mindset, and a lot of work ahead of us. But I think it's positioning us well as a part of the broader climate solution. Let me shift gears here as we're getting a number of really great questions on the comments line. A great question about energy storage. So we've talked a bit about the need for flexibility in a grid that has higher wind and solar. What do you think are the prospects for getting all forms of energy storage, whether it's battery storage or closed loop pump storage? What's your sense of what the election means for energy storage in this country? Who wants to tackle that first?
I could start.
Go for it,
Rich. So I'll just say what I think is great about, two things are great about the conversation around energy storage. One is it's an incredibly bipartisan conversation. So the BEST Act, for example, great name, Better Energy Storage Technology Act, is one of the most bipartisan and popular bills that sort of came out of this Congress. It would set up a moonshot to demonstrate advanced storage technologies at the Department of Energy. The second thing that I think is great about BEST and the general storage conversation is people are starting to realize that storage doesn't just mean taking a bunch of basically electric car batteries and putting them together and calling that a grid scale energy storage solution, right? There are limited niches and applications for something like that. But if storage is going to play a huge role on our grid, it's got to be 24/7, 365, right? It's got to be to meet the challenge of daily storage and weekly storage and eventually seasonal storage. And that means that it's going to have to be, we're going to have to think of storage really differently. It's not just going to be lithium ion batteries. It's going to be all kinds of different technologies in the battery space. It's going to be things like thermal storage and physical storage like pumped hydropower, for example. I think people are realizing we're going to need a much broader range of technologies. And so that's going to mean we're going to need all sorts of things. We're going to need innovation policy to demonstrate new things. We're going to need regulatory reform to get pumped hydro producing up to the scale that we know that it can produce nationally. And we're going to need more either federal or voluntary procurement policies that take the big step that Google, for example, did, which was to change from just, I'm going to produce an amount of renewable energy equal to my annual energy consumption. They've now said by 2030, they're going to match their demand exactly with the energy they procure. They're going to procure clean energy 24/7, and that kind of implies that they're going to be buying a heck of a lot of energy storage at their
incredibly
facility.
ambitious.
Yeah,
I think we're, in addition to all the things you listed that we're going to need a better planning process in the long-term planning process, and we're going to need new market products, both at the very short scale, so the kinds of grid services that ancillary services, and we're going to need some way of bringing into the market the very long-term storage, and whether that's the market or the planning process, we're going to have to. We now know that. I think the deployment of storage is ahead of where it was predicted 5 years ago, but to truly make it, an integrated part of the system where it's helping to deliver those climate benefits and reliability benefits, we're going to need a different way of pricing it. And it's going to be interesting to see what happens with the FERC order 2222, because each of the markets.
Describe what that is, Karen.
Yeah, it's both there's a whole series of the FERC orders over the last couple of years have dealt with demand response, with storage, and then the last one, FERC order 2022, which is distributed energy resources, and allowing aggregated distributed energy resources to play in wholesale markets. And in the last two instances, storage was critical to the resources that can be brought into the wholesale market. But each market is developing their own rules to implement those orders, and I think it's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out. That'll definitely be a 2021 play in terms of, and I don't think that it matters at all what happens in November in terms of how those orders get implemented.
So you actually just hit on the question I was going to ask the group is. Let's talk about energy markets, and the design of those markets is going to drive investment going forward. But those markets are generally fairly deregulated. You've got different RTOs in half the country. They've got their own stakeholder process. To what extent do you think this election actually is going to shape how markets evolve? We've got 2 FERC commissioners that have been nominated but not moved on. What's your sense of, does this election actually matter to the wholesale market evolution, or is that operating kind of independently?
So
I don't know if you want to, Jim, go ahead.
I'll weigh in here. What we have in America right now is a muddle in the middle.
Yeah.
And by the way, nothing is deregulated. It's just the markets are regulated differently depending on where you are. In some, it's well-regulated competition. In others, it's I think poorly regulated monopolization. Okay, so and then the disconnect between regions. That's going to continue to be a muddle regardless, unless there's some big breakthrough event. The green community, the clean energy community, should insist on finishing the job of restructuring so we can actually have a national grid with national competition and with clear emission standards that the innovators can invest against and compete to find the lowest cost solutions to. In the absence of that, there's going to be a lot of market distortion, whether it's at the wholesale level or at the local, the local PUC level. Just one endless distortion after another, making the achievement of clean energy much more expensive than it needs to be to users, and take way too long. Okay, and we know this for the last 30 years. We've been living it, and in the markets that liberalize most, your old home market of Maryland, Malcolm, and Texas. You've seen the biggest, fastest capital stock turnover to clean energy than anywhere else in the world in the markets that restructured the most fastest. And so we already know empirically that costs go down and emissions go down when competition and innovation goes up.
Well, it would be great
want to challenge that.
Well, it'd be great
to
see a new administration really bring together some of the Western states to talk about what it would take to actually pull together a Western market that allows for that large-scale balancing, that large-scale moving of clean energy resources from state to state. So, but that's not necessarily a FERC issue. That is really, if a White House wants to start pulling people together, but there's not necessarily an authority there, just a convening power. But I'll say that I think that FERC will see an evolution no matter what happens. It's not going to be a radical change. And you're still going to have, even if these FERC commissioners get confirmed this year, you'll still have Neil Chatterjee as the chair for another, I think, 6 months or so. I just don't see massive changes. I do think, though, that next year, if there's a Biden administration, we will see an end to this silliness around fuel security versus real resilience and reliability.
Maybe the only thing I'll add is that I actually think the most important elections for the FERC and the RTOs are actually going to be the state level elections this fall, because you've got this huge push and pull between state clean energy policy and kind of FERC's minimum offer price rule, which hopefully most folks listening to this have not been paying attention to, because it's really nerdy, deep in the weeds stuff. Unfortunately, it's extremely important for energy policy and the direction that individual states' energy direction goes. But I think you may well have a lot of states, to Jim's point, kind of deepen the muddle in the middle by actually pulling parts of their capacity markets out of their regional transmission organization, so that they can kind of own their own destiny on on promoting particular assets or clean energy assets or whatever. That's a process that was set in place and initiated under this commission, and I think that the direction of that is really going to be controlled much more by who's running the show in state legislatures and in governor's offices.
Yeah, I'd want to quickly underline Karen's point. I'm in California, and one of my actually disappointments, I was sad that Jerry Brown didn't pull it off, because he's the guy that could have. If California actually anchored a Western regional system, then the entire rest of the West would be able to trade in and out of California on clean energy emissions reductions, and the whole system would balance itself out. And California will never do nuclear, but Utah might, and Wyoming might do carbon capture and storage, which California would never do. But all of that would be able to, California is a big enough market to drive all that investment and innovation, whereas the rest of the individual state markets aren't. And so if I had one bright spot, and Gavin Newsom's a smart guy, next year, if he just decided to do what everybody knows should be done, that alone would help drive the politics in Washington too, because then you'd get the mountain states with their hydro and their gas and their carbon capture and storage and their desire to do nuclear. You get those states actually wanting to be part of a more well-defined cycle on clean energy.
Yeah,
but California being the big enough market to anchor that.
Yeah, and on that, for years, we were trying to convince the California legislature that they should change the governance structure of CalISO. And what that ended up happening was the conversation was about what the benefits would be to Californians if we had a Western grid. And that's the wrong conversation to have in Wyoming, Idaho, Nevada, that what we really needed were better studies about the benefits to those states of joining a Western market. And DOE gave some of those states, Utah, Nevada, Oregon, that those states have money to do a study that looks at those benefits. And there's a STEAM study that may be coming out that may help with some of those conversations. So I think the conversation is shifting in a way that will give more ammunition to the people in the non-Californian states to understand the benefits of that big Western grid.
Along those lines, we've got an interesting question about how does geography impact expansion of clean energy? For instance, Texas is great for wind, but not hydro. Washington State's the opposite. Do you need some kind of California market that anchors this so there's a trading system? Or how does the regional variations in clean energy fit into the politics and the engineering of the grid?
Well, just one thing I'll say, going back to Jim's earlier point about needing to be technology inclusive, technology neutral, not being against the things I'm not specifically for. Like, no one should be talking about requiring 100% renewables in the Southeast, for example, where there's just not amazing renewable capacity, or in parts of the Southeast, right? In those places, it's going to be more hydro and more fossils with carbon capture and more nuclear, and a fair amount of wind and solar as well. But they're just not going to be able to do what Colorado can do, which might be getting to 80, 90, 95%, wind and solar, or like the Pacific Northwest can do, which is get to, in some cases 90% hydropower, right? So we just have wildly different renewable resource mixes across the country. We also have much different public acceptance of nuclear power in different pockets of the country, and we have much different ability to sequester CO2 under the ground in different parts of the country. And so all of that just kind of naturally implies that you're going to want a lot of different options in your clean technology mix.
All right. Well, I know we're. Go ahead, Karen.
Well, the climate impacts are different as well. I mean, we're dealing with massive gigafires in California. We have potential drought impacts in the Northwest that would impact the hydro. We have some extreme heat issues which affect the efficiency of transmission and of solar actually generation in other places. So I think that there's a whole set of analytical work that could be done to figure out that geographical impact and optimizing for that.
So I'm hoping we've got time for two more. I'm hoping we've got time for two more questions, and there's a good one that came in just a moment ago. How does the Trump administration's revision of NEPA affect clean energy? To how much of an extent would a Biden administration go back to the old NEPA rules? If I could expand that question a little bit, the Trump administration has done a fundamental reform of NEPA, but they've also looked at the Endangered Species Act, EPA's Clean Water 401 rule, major reforms, particularly when you take it together. All of those proposals are now finalized and in litigation in the courts. So I'm curious if folks were able to comment on whether you think those rules would survive a Biden administration, and then kind of while we're on the topic, the reason they're doing it through regulation as opposed to Congress is that you've got an uncooperative Congress historically. And so a lot has been done through executive orders. And do you think that's going to be a trend we see, particularly if we've got divided government? So there's a lot there to unpack.
Let me pitch in first. As the former chairman of the Council on Environmental Quality, overseeing NEPA, this conversation misses the point. So I'm going to come back to NEPA, but the problem is actually the opposite of everything that people talk about in this space. So first, what Trump has done has been at the margins, and it's utterly inconsequential in terms of its macroeconomic or environmental impacts. You still have judicial litigation. There's still lots of people are going to fight over everything. 2 years to a decision instead of 5. You still have litigation. It's if you're on the left, don't be worried because it's marginal. If you're on the right, you're fooling yourselves if you think it's valuable. Okay? So the issue for all of us, and I want to go back to what I said at the beginning, net zero by 2050 is economically possible and it's technologically feasible. It's procedurally impossible. Okay? And by procedurally impossible is if you think about the several $1 trillion of new investment that's got to happen on transmission and everything else we talked about, all of that has to be permitted. And it's not just NEPA, it's NEPA and the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, and everything else, federal, state, local. We do not have the public officials to do that amount of processing of permits. So 1, we don't have the people. 2, we don't have the dollars to do the amount of permitting required. 3, we do not have the sort of acceptance yet. And so of the amount of permitting that's going to be required. And a lot of linear permitting has to occur for this across state lines. Okay. So the bigger issue for us is the opposite, which is how do we all come together and insist that the Congress establish a fast track approval process at the federal level for the entire permit suite, and then condition federal grants and other resources that the state and locals match that. We need fully adjudicated approvals in less than a year for every project if we want to get to net zero by 2050. Okay,
that's the next uncommon dialogue for Dan Riker to try to facilitate.
Yeah, and
I thought the one we did was hard.
Why should we do it, and why is it good to do it? Every project has to comply 100% with federal, state, and local law. So this permitting is not about environmental harm, because every project has to comply with all the laws. So why are we taking 5 years for public officials to agree that the project will comply with the law when it has to comply with the law? So how can we get to the point faster where proponents can simply show they'll comply with the law and comply with the law? So it's not against rollbacks. It's about how do we roll these projects forward faster. And we, by the way, it is impossible. Net zero is impossible if we don't do this. We must do it.
Karen, would you advise Nancy Pelosi to fast track that kind of bill?
I feel very strongly that something needs to be done about the permitting process. And I'm not I'm not a NEPA lawyer, but I agree with you, Jim, that there's no way we're going to meet these aggressive climate targets unless we can build new infrastructure. And if it takes us 5 to 10 years, let's say, the solar energy zone in the Obama administration in Nevada, the first solar plant that was built there was conceived of and ribbons cut in less than 3 years. Now, if I think that's acceptable. I mean, through two to 3 years for engineering and building that, but it required a lot of work before that to create the solar energy zones. But if it takes you another 10 years to get an interconnection to transmission, that's unacceptable. And so I agree with you that we are not going to get to these aggressive carbon goals unless we deal with the permitting and siting process. I just don't have a way forward to see how it happens. I mean, there's going to have to be a lot of compromise, in particular from the environmental community that views NEPA and the Clean Water Act and others as bedrock environmental laws that if you reopen them are going to be gutted. And so there's got to be a trust factor there between the energy sector and the enviros that doesn't exist at this point. And I'm not sure, I would certainly have advised Nancy Pelosi to, engage in some serious legislative dialogue on it, but I don't know what the outcome actually looks like that moves fast enough in the legislative process to then affect the construction, siting, permitting, and construction.
So I think that might be a great topic just for the next session, because I know we're almost out of time here, but I would love to dive into that topic because, Jim, I think you've raised a really fundamental issue that, frankly, I don't think industry or the environmental community has really grappled with. How do you reconcile the climate challenge with our regulatory infrastructure and capacity? So I'm going to tee that up as a future topic for conversation. But before we go today, I'd love to do a quick kind of rapid round and ask the panelists to take out their crystal ball and make a prediction about a thing that's going to either happen to watch for during the next election or is going to happen during the next year. And Jim, why don't I let you go first on this one?
Okay, so if the Republicans retain the Senate and if Donald Trump is reelected, the Senate enacts and Donald Trump signs a clean energy bill, the clean energy standard, and America rejoins the Paris Agreement.
Wow, I like that prediction. Okay. Karen, you're up next.
Oh, I think no matter what happens in November, I think we're finally going to get an infrastructure week in 2021.
All right. It won't be infrastructure week every week again.
No.
Rich, what's your crystal ball prediction?
Well, I'm going to focus on something probably nobody pays attention to, but it's the most important energy policymaker in DC because they pass the most important energy bill virtually every single year, which is the Energy and Water Appropriations Bill out of Congress, right? So these are the people that are writing the checks. And because we only pass major energy bills, well, last one was 13 years ago, because we really don't pass new authorizing policy very often, we do all of our policy through the appropriations process. Senator Alexander, who currently runs this in the Senate, is retiring this year. And so he'll be succeeded by somebody that could well be Susan Collins if Senator Collins survives her reelection in Maine. And if not, there's a couple of other people who might be in line. But I think that that new person coming into place in the Senate, whether Republicans are in the majority or the minority, that's going to be an extremely powerful position. That's a changing of the guard that'll happen next year. And that will quietly be perhaps the most important new energy policymaker in DC next year that nobody else is paying any attention to.
Thanks, Rich. Thanks for shining a spotlight on that critical role. I guess my prediction is going to be that next year, 2021, we're going to see groundbreaking for the first major pump storage facility in the country. We haven't had one in several decades, and I'm not going to bet which one is going to actually break ground, but I'm going to hope that 2021 is the year. With that, let me thank all of the panelists, commentators for joining us today. This has been as lively a conversation as I thought it was going to be. We're going to find out a lot of answers. Well, maybe we'll find out a lot of answers on November 3rd. We may just have more questions, but look forward to continuing these conversations with all of you. Special thanks to ClearPath for partnering and co-sponsoring this event with us. Thank you all, and have a great rest of your day. Take care, everybody.
Take care.
Thanks so much. Good to see everyone.